Okay, so here we are, yet another lecture, and this one is about memory. And it just seems like everything that we learn in Psych 1 is so cool that every lecture is better than the next one, but maybe not. At first, when I thought I was going to teach memory, I thought, well, what is there to know, really? But it's just so interesting. And we're going to get into it. There's a lot of just learning what to call things in this lecture, you know, and thinking about the component parts of each process when we're talking about remembering and forgetting. So there's a lot of lists that we're going to encounter in this lecture. But the other thing that's really good about this lecture is that I've got a whole bunch of extra links of interesting things that you can click on and learn more about. Let's get going. So here, if we were together in the class, we would play a memory game together just for fun. You know the card game where you try to you turn them over one at a time and turn it back over and you try to make a match? Yeah, we would do this online. And it would serve no purpose other than to show that our memories work. But let's talk about what memory is. The definition of memory is the persistence of learning over time. It's the process by which information is encoded, stored, and retrieved. Anyway, oh, sorry for the sound effects. But what's neat about this is we're now talking about the persistence of learning. Last lecture was about learning and all the different ways that learning may take place. Memory is when learning persists, that you've actually got information or knowledge or understanding that's stored somewhere that you can then retrieve. So the three different parts of the ESR model of memory it is encoding, storage, and retrieval. And I have some pictures for you to illustrate what this is. So here we have encoding. This is like, so here you have a family and they're bringing the boxes into the house. So that's like bringing something in from the outside, bringing it in and encoding it. Storage is finding a place to put it. In this case, I'm giving you a picture of an attic because we're picturing all of these boxes that are stored up in the attic. And retrieval is being able to go up into the attic, find the box that has a thing so you can bring it down and put it on your coffee table when you want it. So that's my metaphor, is like a house as the mind and these ins and outs as the ESR model of memory. There's also something to be talked about in terms of the levels of processing. So when we're encoding information, we could have a shallow level of processing, illustrated here by Ron Burgundy, where you're just encoding the appearance of the sound. Okay, that's red. Okay, that's loud. Okay, that's hot. Deep processing is encoding the word and linking it to other similar words or previously learned material. So here we have deep processing. This is symbolized by Walter Cronkite. You may be too young to remember Walter Cronkite as a news anchor, but he's famous for like getting teary and crying at the moon landing. You know, he got all choked up. And that was like significant because he was very serious, level, comforting voice coming into people's living rooms back in the day. But I used him as an example of deep processing because deep processing is about making connections and linking an idea to other ideas, like, oh, hot, just like that time that we were in New Mexico, right? So that's an idea of deep processing, that you're pulling in the information and you're also connecting it to something else. And the key about deep processing is that the deeper you're processing, the easier it is to recall. There's a 3-stage memory model for us to talk about. And those 3 stages involve sense memory. That was stage 1. Stage 2 is short-term memory. And stage 3 is long-term memory. And we're going to talk about each one of these in detail, but I particularly like this graphic in this slide because it tells you the purpose of sense memory is to just hold the sensation. The purpose of short-term memory is to hold it temporarily and to maybe manipulate it enough to get it sent to long-term memory, which receives and stores the information for a long time. Sometimes you could call it relatively permanent because some things in your long-term memory you'll never forget. But there are things now let's look at sense memory. There, sense memory, like here we have iconic memory. Iconic memory is visual, and that only lasts for like half a second. When you see something, most people usually can't recall it after half a second. And that's different than echoic memory. Think echo, sound. Echoic memory is auditory. It's what you hear. That lasts longer. And so many people believe that um, it's it's good to combine different types of input, sensory input. So let's say you're reading an article or listening to a lecture, so I'm giving you this picture of this baby doll face to try to give you something to remember the difference between iconic memory and echoic memory. There's the ear, there's the eye. It's just something different to maybe enter into your head in a different way while you're listening to my voice. So you're having both of these things go on. If you don't transfer it to short-term memory, you lose it forever. Like I like to think of an example as of like being, you can sense whether or not it's hot in the room right now. Depending on the day, depending on the air conditioning, you may experience the temperature as hot or cold. Let's pretend you're experiencing it as cold. Now, you're not going to remember whether it's cold in part because you're probably not going to pay much attention to whether it's cold. Because you're sitting in a room that you know most of the time you can control. But let's imagine that we were in classroom together. It was the first day of class and you were listening to me lecture and you noticed that it was cold. Now, you're in a classroom, a new environment, one that ostensibly you're going to have to come back to again and again. You may actually pay more attention to the idea of that sensation of being cold because you might need to remember to bring a sweater next time, right? But if you're sitting around at your house, you don't have any real reason to pay any attention or remember what the temperature was like on the day that you listened to this lecture. It's probably going to just go right out of your memory. But now short-term memory, that's where sense memory gets sent to. So what you see, what you hear, what you feel, what you taste. It's going to be sent to your short-term memory, and your short-term memory is going to store it temporarily, just long enough to get it transferred to your long-term memory if it sort of meets the criteria of being worthy. And there are different, there have been many studies that identify that this short-term memory is limited, and it tends to be limited to 5 to 9 items. That's why our telephone numbers like 8675309, like that I'm going to give you an opportunity to listen to that song in its entirety, but it's a song from the 80s. A telephone number is 7 digits long because the studies have shown that that's about right for what we're even able to remember. Once the digits get past 9, we tend to make more mistakes. There are different theories about how to optimize your short-term memory. And one theory is chunking and the other is maintenance rehearsal. And we're going to take a minute, we're going to look at chunking. So if we were in class together, chunking is this idea that you can group components of things and remember the group instead of each individual item. So here you have, if I give you 10 seconds to remember this, I'm not going to say it out loud because that might change the outcome. I'm going to count to 10. Remember this, and then I'm going to have you shut your eyes and try to write them down. You can cheat all you want. It doesn't matter. It's just an exercise. So I'm going to count to 10. Do what you can to remember this. Okay, stop. Look away and try to write down as many as you can do. I'll give you 10 seconds. Okay, how many did you get right? Now, if we were in class together, I would have given half of you this thing to memorize, and I would have given half of you this thing to memorize. And what we would have seen is the half of the class that was able to read this set of letters as X, NBC, PhD, SAT, CBS, X. So what you see is this string of letters is actually pretty easily chunkable into these different units of letters that are easier to remember. So the half of the class that got this to memorize memorized all the letters like no problem. And the half of the class that got this to memorize, the one that I gave you, all kind of struggled a bit to get to remember much of it. Okay. And now for maintenance rehearsal, again, I can't make you listen to this video, but I can invite you to. It's an example from the 80s when I was a girl, let's say, when I was a young person in high school. There was this song, Jenny, I've got your number. And it goes 8675309. And so I could probably go to anybody who went to high school at my time and say, what was Jenny's number? And they would be able to say 8675309 because it's said over and over and over again in the song. It's also a catchy little tune, but it's this idea. Maintenance rehearsal is like saying it over and over and over again to try to remember something. So go and enjoy that video if you care to. The other thing that's important about short-term memory is to realize that when they came up with this model, this 3-stage model, they called it sensory, short-term, and long-term memory. But in the meantime, in the years that ensued, people started to talk about short-term memory in terms of working memory, because it's less about the length of time and more about what it is that the memory has to do, because there's a lot of work that needs to happen. For example, it needs to select which sensory information to pay attention to. It needs to also not only send information to long-term memory, but also retrieve information from long-term memory to try to see if it's worth remembering at all. And it needs to manipulate the information for the optimal use. For example, if you were going to do some chunking, like I'm going to remember this 3 letters at a time, then that would all be happening in your working memory. And here, as a symbol of what the working memory is, I have an ER scene where everybody, like the incoming patients and the patients that are going to surgery and there's a lot of work going on in the working memory at every moment. Long-term memory has some different components. And typically, long-term memory is divided into explicit memory or implicit memory. And so explicit memory is that which you can remember consciously. You are aware of it. Implicit memory means you're not aware of it. And there's 2 different types of explicit memory. That's semantic memory. So if you go and you study engineering and you learn about the currents of electricity, you're going to understand the difference between frequency and amplitude of a wave. All of that is semantic. You're just learning the actual things, the facts, the names. Here we have, there are 12 months in a year. A spider has 8 legs. All of that is semantic. You're doing an awful lot of semantic learning in this class. As you go through the reading guides and you answer all these questions, you're engaging in semantic learning. You're remembering that Bandura was associated with self-efficacy. You're remembering that why can't I remember the classical conditioning guy? Pavlov, did the experiment with the dogs. All of that is semantic memory. Episodic memory is memory about your lifetime. This is, I remember where I was. That would actually be a flashbulb memory. Episodic memory would be, I remember what I was doing during COVID-19 times. I only showered twice a week and I wore out my favorite sweatpants, or whatever. Like that might be your episodic memory. Or you may remember your graduation or your lack of graduation or your silly Zoom graduation. But they're all episodes in your lifetime. So episodic tends to be personal, lived, and experienced. There are different types of implicit memory. So there are the procedural skills. To me, this is like the latent learning in a certain way where you're driving a car or you're brushing your teeth. You're doing things that you're not consciously aware of because you've learned it so much. You don't need to think about it. You don't need to be aware of of moving your foot to speed up and slow down and move it to the brake because your body has just proceduralized this. It's just known. There's also classically conditioned memory, which we've learned about last week, and this idea of priming, that just exposure to something, whether you're consciously aware of it or not, can change your behavior. And over the course of the rest of this, we will talk more about priming, especially when we talk about emotions and positive emotions, because positive emotions have, especially when they're subconscious and you're not really paying attention to it, it can have an effect on your behavior. If you want to improve your long-term memory, there are some different ideas about what you can do. For example, you can organize things by assigning them into hierarchical categories. Here I have a closet, the shirt side, the dress side, the pants shelf, as an idea of how you might organize the information. Or you might think of things as there are furry animals and scaly animals, and then start to organize things in that way. There's elaborative rehearsal. What is that? It's different than maintenance rehearsal. Elaborative rehearsal is more related to deep processing. This is where you actually expand, reflect, question, distinguish. What does this remind you of? Hopefully it reminds you of my course, because I'm asking you to reflect, to question, to distinguish between one thing and another thing. And hopefully this is helping you learn some of the semantic memory stuff. And another really important way to do elaborative rehearsal is to link it to yourself. So here I have a picture of a scrapbook where you're going to remember your road trip because you're going to link it to things that are related to you or to your experiences. It's just making the information meaningful. And I've seen a lot of you do that when you share or when you reflect on things in your papers about even like the taste of a tangerine or the taste of a lime. You were connecting it to memories that you may have had when you were little. So now you're really hopefully encoding into your long-term memory information about sensation and perception. Another thing is retrieval cues. Encoding specificity principle means that you can recall things better when the cues around you are similar. And this is pertinent when we're, say, in a classroom. I'll say sometimes people like to go to the room where they're going to take the exam in order to do their studying because they could potentially attach certain memories while looking at the clock, while looking at the lectern, while looking at the door. They can potentially use the cues in the room that they're in to help them recall it later. And this mnemonic devices, there are many different types, but here I have a symbol of a palace. That's the memory palace. That maybe you've heard Sherlock Holmes talk about, where he has an imaginary room and that's where he places certain bits of information so that he can remember it. And he can like walk through the room in his mind to remember things. I've never been able to do that, but I do love palaces. I don't I don't like the idea of palaces, but I like to look at them. Let's put it that way. I don't like the idea of people with that much power and money over everyone else. That's my personal opinion. All right, positive emotions have a nice relationship to memory. And I pulled some of these forward. Good mood improves your working memory, and stress inhibits it. So remember that scene that we just saw of the emergency room, of how your working memory has to do all of this stuff at once. If you're stressed out, remember we studied stress, and your cortisol levels are high and your heartbeat is increasing and you're sweating, your working memory doesn't work as efficiently as if you're in a good mood, relaxed and happy. So another is that your memories are recalled better when they match your current mood. So you remember things based on mood. So if you're laughing really hard, like often if I find myself laughing really hard, I'm going to remember my cousin with whom my whole life I have laughed forever. So um uh because the mood will match another memory where I had a mood, and that will send me all the way through all sorts of episodic memory of when we went camping and when we went to the ocean that one time, and all of those will come back. So moods can, so this is another thing, is you want to potentially, that could potentially be a tip for studying for tests too, is try to feel good, not only during the exam, but while you're studying for the exam, so your good mood matches. So, and then and I'm going to give you this little. I have this picture of this girl, and what she says to herself is, "Exams are fun. They give me a chance to remember things that are important to me." I'm enough of a nerd that I really believe this. This is how I feel about exams. I kind of dig them, especially since I did so much extra credit. I don't know why I have that. But anyway, like having a framework for understanding exams is useful. And if you can integrate materials in terms of how it fits with your best self, you're going to have a better chance of remembering it. So integrating it with what a dummy you are or how lazy you tend to be isn't probably going to help you remember things, but integrating it with things like, oh yeah, you're very helpful to your family, and memories that shine a good light on you, that will potentially help you recall things better. Now we're going to talk about forgetting. This is Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve. This guy, Ebbinghaus, did these experiments on himself. He essentially remembered nonsense syllables, and he measured how much of those nonsense syllables he could remember over time. And after 1 hour, he could only remember 44%. After 1 week, he could only remember 21%. So it's this idea that memories for certain things fall off over time. Now, it's important to remember that Ebbinghaus was remembering nonsense syllables. He wasn't using these techniques of making it relevant to yourself or integrating it with your experience. Meaningful memories may have a different relationship to forgetting than Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve tells us. So there are different theories of forgetting. One theory is your neurons decay. If you don't consciously recall things on a regular basis, you're going to forget things. Use it or lose it. Another is interference. Like when new info interferes with old info, it's like so much new information is coming in, I can't remember the old info. That's called retroactive interference. When old info interferes with new info, so you're sitting in class, in psychology class, but really what you're most fascinated by is engineering stuff, and all you can think about are engineering principles, it may prevent you from remembering that Skinner was important for the, operant conditioning. All right, motivated forgetting. This is when you want to forget, like distressing memories. And encoding failure is when the information never made it out of short-term memory. So I don't know if that's so much forgetting as much as it never became a memory in the first place. And then there's retrieval failure. So You know something, you just can't retrieve it. This is called the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where it's in there. Like, oh, and I just did it with what's his name? Pavlov. Yeah, right. I knew it. I just couldn't quite get it in time to impress you. Okay. There are different factors in forgetting. The misinformation effect, where you can give people misinformation and then it becomes a memory. I'm going to give you an example of this in a second. Another factor in forgetting is the primacy effect. You tend to remember the first thing that you learned. And the recency effect. You tend to remember the last thing that you learned. The most at risk of getting forgotten is this stuff in the middle. There's also source amnesia, where you know something, but you can't remember who told you. This happens to me all the time because I'm telling people my bits of wisdom that I got from psychology, and then a year later they'll tell me about this fascinating study they heard about, and I'm the one who told them. But anyway, and maybe you'll have that same experience when you walk out into the world with all this great psychology learning that you've got. There's also spacing practice. Distributed practice is spacing out your intervals of studying instead of cramming. So, making room for stuff to get in. Don't try to remember it. Don't try to study for everything that you learned in psychology in 10 minutes. Ain't gonna work. But, when you space out your study times, you're going to do better on tests. It's less and less relevant, this exam business, because I'm not asking you to remember anything except where to find it in the chapters, right? Or where to look for it in your notes, because it's all open book these days. And then culture can influence the types of things that you forget. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. I want to give you this study of implanting false memory. I love this study. So it's by Morgan et al. In 2013. And essentially they took participants into one room, let's say this room, and they gave them an interview. They interviewed them. But that was just for show. The real part of the study was when they went into the other room and started asking questions about the first room. And some of the participants were asked these neutral questions, like, was there a telephone in the room? And others were asked these leading, implanting questions where they're asking, what color was the telephone? And so it goes. Now, later, they asked them even more questions about the whole experience altogether. And what happened was, those who were asked the neutral question, was there a telephone in the room? Only 10% of them remembered a telephone. That's what you would expect, especially when there was no telephone in the room. But among those who were asked what color was the telephone, 98% said there was a telephone in the room. So this is an example of a false memory being implanted just by the questions that were asked and the assumptions underlying the questions. So beware of this. This is a very this study just made me stand up and take notice. We're going to talk a tiny bit about the biology of memory, and this idea of long-term potentiation is interesting for those of you who are interested in the nerves and the neurons. So long-term potentiation is like the state of a neuron when it is largely used, right? And so you know that a neural pathway is strengthened when there is increased dendritic branching and when there's an increased release of neurotransmitters. And here we have a picture of a potentiated dendrite, a potentiated synapse path, and a non-normal one. So this is sort of a pathway that gets used a lot. It has more neurotransmitters, it has more doohickeys, and there it is. Another interesting idea is flashbulb memories. These are the memories that you have, like I almost talked about it earlier. Like, do you remember where you were when they said they were shutting down the economy this spring? Maybe. Do you remember where you were when they announced the election results that maybe disappointed you or excited you? My biggest flashbulb memory is 9/11. And if we were in the same room together, I'd probably stop and tell you about how I was going to work in New York City that morning and what it was like. I remember everything, everything. Maybe not, I just, there's so vivid memories of being in the subway and the sense of panic, that came into the subway of somebody coming in and say, a plane hit the World Trade Center. And then I remember coming up out of the subway after a while, after it got moving again. And I remember like these two Wall Street types. We wasn't on Wall Street. It was Midtown, and they were looking up in the sky at something. And that is so weird in New York. People don't look at the sky in New York unless you're a tourist. You just go about your business. So I remember turning around and looking at the towers burning. The memory goes on and on and on. It's one of those vivid, vivid flashbulb memories. So it's so emotionally significant. And maybe you have your own flashbulb memories. Very quickly, when we're talking about amnesia, there are different types. I'm offering you this slide to help you understand the difference between retrograde amnesia, where your old memories are lost, but your new memories are okay, and anterograde amnesia, where your old memory is okay, but you can't form new memories. I am over time, so I'm going to rush through a couple of these slides. I want to offer you this information about traumatic brain injury and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I have links here on the slides that you can look at. I think this is very interesting and very important. It's come out as a result of football players having so many concussions that over time, over the years, their brains start to deteriorate, as you can see here, and it leads to loss of memory, dementia. And I also want to point your attention to the fact that one of the key risk factors, it's not just sports, it's also domestic violence. When people get hit repeatedly in the head, it can lead to this type of terrible, terrible trauma disorder. And I'm giving you some links to the story about Hedda Nussbaum. She was one of the first people in the legal system that used a battered wife syndrome defense. And this New York Times article was just a moving interview with Hedda Nussbaum years later. She was involved in the death of a young girl, basically her daughter. And she was, I think, convicted because she didn't protect the daughter. But it was also observed that she was horrifically abused. So if it's worthwhile for you to read about this person because she had an important impact on our cultural understanding about domestic violence. And there's that. Here's a picture of Alzheimer's disease, which is another thing that can go wrong with your brain. This is the PET scan of a normal brain compared to the PET scan with a person with Alzheimer's disease. And these blank areas that aren't working are the areas that are essential for memories. We can talk a little bit more about memory distortions. You'll read about that in the chapter. Very interesting. I won't go into it now. And this little handy list of memory strategies, this is the last slide, where it's strategies for improving your memory. So in the coding process, you can reduce interference, study in places that are quiet, where there's not a lot of other things going on. You can develop deep level processing. get in the habit of connecting it and linking it with things that you already know. And you can start reviewing in the middle. For example, if you want to make sure that you um, are remembering that hard to remember middle, if you're studying for a chapter, you can start right in the middle of the reading guide, say. We talked about chunking. There's creating hierarchies. One of the key, like if you're doing an exam that you actually have to remember something, one of the best ways to study for the exam is practice questions and self-testing. Because this is the key insight here is it's not so much about what you know, it's about what you can remember and what you can recall at when you need to. So here's your advice on memory. I hope you enjoy it. You're gonna another good chapter. We're just having so much fun in this course, and I wish you good week.